You're listening to Dead Air Podcast, part of splatterbutchers.net.
What's up, everybody? Wes, Dead Air Knife here with Always.
Typical Lydia.
Today's show, we're going to be doing the 1980 classic, The Changeling. Boom, 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 boom. That's my ball.
Funny, I don't remember a ball in the 2008 Angelina Jolie mystery crime drama. For some reason, that movie takes over Google. So whenever you're looking for the Changeling stuff, the first hit is gonna be the wrong movie.
That happens sometimes. It is unfortunate. It's weird when films that have similar titles take over. I've experienced that a lot with remakes, right? So the House on Sorority Row remake tends to dominate the internet, and when you're Googling things, it's going to be one of the first things that you get. Like Black Christmas, holy fuck. There's 3 different versions now.
Yeah, true. And when you're looking up Black Christmas and you find the book that is absolutely unrelated but has a very cool cover, so you think that it's probably the novelization, and it's not. I remember being kind of feeling ripped off that this wasn't actually about a true changeling, like a mythological changeling.
You know, I'm so obtuse of a person that it never even occurred to me for a second why the movie might have been called The Changeling, and I just accepted it as this is just the title of the movie, and my vacant pea brain didn't bother to put that together whatsoever. Even the old switcheroo that this plot heavily implies. They never confirm anything, but the switcheroo that the plot implies didn't really dawn on me whatsoever.
There was a short film. I can't remember what anthology it was part of. It wasn't Tales of Halloween, and it wasn't Crossroads. It was one of those horror anthology, and it had the best changeling story, and I wish I could remember it right now. That's what I wanted out of this film. I didn't want the Mr. Burns stolen from the orphanage kind of story. Well, that's what he strikes me as.
He's very Mr. He's very Mr. Burns like.
So even getting in the spruce moose. But yeah, I really wanted this to be a dyed-in-the-wool Irish fairy changeling story. Probably because I was told sort of these like mishmash fairy tales as a child, like the boogeyman kind of stories, where the whatever creatures come and put you in a sack and carry you off kind of thing. And like changeling stories, and it always comes down to a careful what you wish for sort of thing, which this story doesn't. Most changeling stories do have a careful what you wish for moral, and this one does not. And we'll also enter into, again, another film that I was bored to tears by as a kid or teen.
I definitely am not going to be able to defend it as vigorously as I defended Pumpkinhead as a, you're out of your mind. This movie isn't boring. It's a visual tour de force. This film is a tour de force of a different kind, of acting and opulence and sweater vests and cardigans in general. But it's not necessarily something that a kid is going to enjoy. For God's sakes, it's almost as if you are sitting in your grandparents' house listening to a clock tick.
It absolutely is, and I think that's what it was. Like, oh, it's not a changeling story. Oh well, it's a ghost story. Okay, I can handle that. I like Scooby Doo or whatever as a teen, or I like 13 Ghosts, something like that. Yeah, 13 Ghosts. It is not. I mean, it is a very, very gothic story. So if someone would
Yes.
have said to me as a teen, had I understood fully what a gothic horror was, that's more of what this is. And so I can, when people say that this movie is a big yawn or it's not scary or all of those things that people say about this movie when they're detractors, I can sort of agree from the point of view of a 15-year-old horror hound who wants
Hmm.
blood and guts and jump scares galore. That's what I wanted at that age from a horror film. And I didn't dislike this film as much as just knew it wasn't for me. It was a yawn, wasn't interested in watching it. I also caught it on television. Like,
Mm.
it was on TV and my mom was like, "Oh, The Changeling. I really like that movie." And then she went off to do dishes or whatever. So, yeah. And it was like, "Oh, did you see the bowel dancing scene? Isn't that scary?" And it was like, "Get a life, mother," kind of reaction from eye rolling teenage angst style Lydia horror hound. So I get it, but it's from that point of view of a very, you know, undeveloped or underdeveloped horror fan's mind. So all the people out there that are saying that this is a yawn and it's not scary, they have juvenile horror tastes. Sorry to say.
I tend to agree. I find it depressing. We've talked about this a few times on the show before. I genuinely find it depressing when people don't step outside of their comfort zone and engage with types of horror that are more quiet, sleepy, more cerebral. But I think that there is very much, and the more I interact with horror fans online, which I didn't really ever do honestly until very recently, even with my social media, my observation seems to be that you really can determine someone's taste quite quickly. And to me, who just spent most of their life consuming everything, that I didn't care if something was exploitative and schlocky. That's great. If something was gothic, if I was listening to or watching a bunch of vampires in tweed suits in a very twee English countryside, I was just as entertained with that. And that actually kind of goes more to my interest in George C. Scott as an actor, which I'll discuss in a little bit. But I agree with you essentially that people need to learn, particularly, I hate to say it, younger generations need to learn how to put their phones down and watch a film that is not trying to fight for your attention. And I think The Changeling, while I can understand people's frustrations, particularly early on in the film, I think that it more than makes up for that with spectacle later. In fact, a lot higher spectacle than you would ever suspect, given how quiet the early stages of the film is after the initial accident, of course.
Yeah, it almost gets to a point that the entity does. And I wouldn't call it a counterpart by any means, except that the manifestation is treated very similarly uh, to a certain point without the like big time scientific intervention. If someone is looking for that sort of spectacle, which this movie does have a payoff, fast forward to the 35-minute mark of the film. 32 minutes, I think, to be exact, is when the horror film begins. If that's what you're out for, we can watch this movie with our phones in our hands, but we've earned it. to sound really pompous here. We've watched this movie a couple times. We know what mode we've watched it, as a bored teen, perhaps. We've watched it while we're paying rapt, strict attention to, suck out every ounce of horror juice this film has, because it is an important Canadian horror film. It's an important Gothic. It's an important modern Gothic for the time, when it was filmed. And it is like really effective storytelling. It is a beautiful film, and it has begotten so many other great films, because I don't know if explicitly The Ring is based on The Changeling or influenced by The Changeling, but by God, it's the same damn film. So if I was joking last night, if you took The Changeling and tinted it sort of blue and updated the soundtrack, you'd have The Ring all over again.
Particularly that digging scene, it's impossible not to. The Ring, one of my favorite horror films of all time. And even that film, some people, the Japanese version, Ring, not necessarily The Ring that was remade, although it kind of depends on who I like both. But even as recently as just last week, Arrow released a very gorgeous collector's edition, a J Horror Rising, they refer to it. There's 7 Japanese horror films within the collection. And so many people who had bought it said the same thing, in that they don't really like J horror because it's boring, but they're trying to mature themselves as viewers. And great effort. I'm glad that
Yeah.
you're trying to experience this type of stuff. And when I was also a wee lad, when that film first came out, I also thought that the Japanese version was sleepier and quieter compared to the American version, which has so much more bombast to it, as subtly so, but it does. So I definitely noticed those comparisons while I was watching the film again. And I wanted to ask you specifically about ghost stories in horror. We've done a few on the show before, some fairly seminal works, and some more modern ghost stories as well. Do you feel as though the quieter cerebral nature is just part of the subgenre in general?
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, barring stories like Poltergeist and things like that are like super modern,
Mm-hmm.
or stories that are deliberately trying to turn the ghost story on its head by being not a ghost story at all or whatever. Yeah, they are, because it's typically somebody in their home alone having to uh, explain to other people what it is that they're experiencing. Like the beginning of the film Malignant was very much a ghost story. It was a poltergeist story,
Mm-hmm.
and it was slow, and it was dark, and it was brooding, and it was that sort of creeping terror, and it was like relying a lot on darks and lights and what you can't see, and just like the boundaries of your perception, literally and figuratively. And that's a very personal, sleepy thing that you need to also observe. There, it isn't storytelling as much as story showing with a ghost story to get you also scared. So it just, but yeah, by nature definitely is like a sleepier, more brooding style of storytelling.
Do you think that that's why larger studios like Blumhouse moved away from ghosts strictly speaking to demons, and then also ghosts that could more be described as entities, constantly referring to things as entities when you don't want to explicitly call them demons? Like, for
Mhm.
example, lights That's a good example of like, is this supposed to be a demon? It seems like a ghost, but she operates like a demon.
Yeah, and I think that we're also moving out of the fact that ghosts aren't as pretty anymore. Ghosts aren't, mid 19th or 18th century spooks in like that sort of like we're not going to see people in an Abe Lincoln top hat. We're not going to see people in petticoats and frocks and the woman in black. And like we're going to see, as author Nathaniel Giles points out, a guy dressed in painter's whites that's stumbling around your house saying, "Where are my cigarettes?" That's not, it's not fucking scary. It's not scary anymore. So it's way more fun to either go back in time with our hauntings and do something like this is now a period piece, sorry to say, and
Hmm.
like really dig into period pieces for real with like the woman in black or the others or something like that. Now to do demons, that's fun. That's rock and roll. Hail Satan. That's fun. To do entities opens it up again because
Hmm.
then it could be anybody and it could be even a psychic thing from somebody who's next door to you, or
Hmm.
the whole idea of where initially, like the 13-year-old prepubescent girl is attracting all these dark forces,
Mm.
and it's really her channeling them. So it's not like a 17th century woman who was hung at the tree behind your house, or a young kid that was killed inadvertently and buried under your house, which happens a lot, or a bride that was buried in the foundation of your house, which happens just as often.
This is I don't know if this is a Wes pick or a Lydia pick. I think we kind of mutually came to the same conclusion. I don't know who said Changeling first, but I want to say that there's something about this film that I thought we would never cover it, and I don't really know why.
That's weird. Yeah, maybe thinking it was sleepy. I mean, it seems like such a perfect pick because it is a Canadian film, really honestly, and it is like a period that we really like. It sort of straddles that slasher boom heading into the next real slasher boom. It straddles like sleepy hammer style horror into the more modern storytelling. I mean, it's got a lot of interesting tactics. Like it's not super um, riddled with effects or anything like that, but it has masterful storytelling and a really good script and good actors, like really good actors. It has a pleasing score. It's nothing to write home about, but it's pleasing and it's fitting. So it's got all of those sort of the technical specifications in the right spots for it to be appealing to us. Um, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe we thought it was a little tired, a little sleepy. Maybe it's partially like I wouldn't have suggested it earlier, I don't think, because there were so many other cool movies to get to.
I I really like that our show has been going on for as long as it has because it's really affording us an opportunity to just really tackle fucking anything. And the best thing about it is I always just feel like we could do this show until one of us drops dead because or completely loses interest, but I'm going for drops dead. But and there's just so many classic movies. I consider this movie a pretty big film when you're a horror fan. And I think I like what you said about it being a period piece because there's an aspect of this film that I think I enjoy a lot is that the cast is much older. There's
Mhm.
not really a lot of fresh faces if you include everyone who is alive within the narrative. And so when you're talking about a movie where people are in their 60s and 70s doing all of this stuff, and even if the actors weren't really that age, you think back like, okay, well, they're talking about 1906. They're talking about like the 1920s. People who are still alive like Carmichael is an old man now, which means that yeah, in the the early 1900s, this motherfucker was alive.
I do wonder for how long, though, that this film won't feel like it's trapped in a time fully unattainable to us, you know? They can still go through the Hall of Records and the microfiche, but there will come a time where that is antiquated. That will be our wax cylinders, right? So for now, it is still a modern film, but and a modernized story. At the time, it must have seemed like a very modern ghost story, with starting out with all of these landmarks of New York and airplane rides, and there's constant airplane rides, and everyone's hyper rich and all that, so they can afford a lot of these modern luxuries. So, all that aside, right? Looking at it now, even though we can still reach out and touch somebody that was born in the early 1900s. So we still could reach out and touch somebody that was born in the time where a coal cart would have been running over a little girl outside of a downtown mansion. Like, it's still not completely removed. It's not horses and buggies.
I think a lot of the popularity of ghost stories from the 1800s, a lot of those shorts turning up in pulps and that sort of thing really captured people's imagination. So I think that when we think about ghost manifestation, which, by the way, the translucent, wispy ghost, by the time the 1800s rolled around, was kind of a new concept. Previously, within narrative, it was more typical that people would imagine ghosts as solid beings. You can see that in some older films where ghosts just look like people. And you say, why aren't they see-through? I was like, well, because it was not always so that ghosts were interpreted that way. And I think that this notion of things becoming modern, still in 1980s, they were trying to find, or 1980 proper, even though there's that watermark at the beginning of the movie that says copywritten 1979, so I always get confused about what year this film was actually released. The the idea that you are updating these stories for a modern time while still having vestiges of it locked firmly in the past.
Like the idea of these ghosts being from the turn of the century. And in 1980, we really felt that we were this jet set, neon pink, living in the
Mm-hmm.
future, high tech lifestyle. And it's almost laughable looking back now at how, yeah, like we have evolved so much. And like putting into context with the youngest child to be killed in this, and the mentions of just the early 1900s. That was when photography was coming into its own, and probably has a lot to do with why the translucent ghost was a thing, because of the photographic tricks that people could do that rendered a person translucent because of the trick being employed to make them look like ghostly. But the stories and the hauntings of the actual houses, we had like a resurgence of this 1950s mediumship in the 80s for whatever reason, probably going hand in hand with the satanic panic, that people were interested again in seances, or going down to the land registry office and pulling up the microfiche to find out who died in your house and stuff like that. That was like all the rage at the time. And so I can see how that had been like superimposed over top of this is a modern lifestyle, and he's a modern man with a modern had a modern family, and he's having a modern man's reaction to darkness in his life.
There's so many modern books at the time that were getting released about real cases. Like I'm thinking of Amityville, I'm thinking of The Entity, I'm thinking of the Warrens really kind of coming into their own and becoming famous and doing tours. Like there was such an interest in ghost stories and the idea of these entities affecting modern homes, modern neighborhoods, even though this estate that George C. Scott's character is staying at is not modern. It very much is of the old world. It's still, like you said, the New York stuff, the Seattle stuff, all of this stuff kind of blending modern and classic ghost story at the same time. But fuck all that, Lydia. We've been talking for almost 30 minutes. What is this movie even about anyways? We got to let them know.
This movie is about the first 30 minutes. It is about the 32 minutes that happen before we get to the ghost story proper. This is about how George C. Scott ain't got time for your shit. He ain't got time. He ain't got time for, waiting and flagging down somebody in the road. He's going to have to make a call. So he leaves his daughter and wife tending to themselves while he goes and makes a call to get their car fixed. He doesn't have time for this bull crap. This mourning. He's walking around his house mourning the death of his wife and child. Who's got time for that? Better get out of town. Gotta clear my head. And then this ghost. Oh my God, I don't got time for this shit. Wes had pointed out, well before the first 30 minutes of this show, that George C. Scott mostly, or John will call him by his character's name, seems mostly annoyed by this haunting. And he absolutely is.
Well put. I want to talk for a minute about the masculine urge to bury your feelings deep down inside of you and not acknowledge perhaps the notion that the death of your wife and daughter could hurt your feelings.
It's so Hank Hill.
Yeah, and much like Hank Hill, where in one episode he thought his dog was dying, he turned on all of his power tools in his garage, closed the garage door, and under that cacophony of noise allowed himself to cry privately where no one was looking. This is the exact same idea. Now, George C. Scott, for people who are fans of old Hollywood, doesn't really need a lot of introduction. But my introduction to him was from the 1997 adaptation of 12 Angry Men. If you want to see a bunch of men, the cast is incredible. James Gandolfini, Jack Lemmon, all that kind of stuff. If you want to see a group of 12 men, sweaty men at extreme close-ups, determining if a young man will indeed go get the death penalty or be freed based on all this evidence, man, is that a great movie. And George C. Scott is the juror, the last holdout, the one who is most convinced that this goddamn rotten kid, like the way that he says it. So my introduction to George C. Scott is an angry, sweaty, just absolutely consumed by rage one moment and stoic and silent the next. And so when I later encountered an older film of his, The Changeling, my initial reaction was, this is going to be odd. Am I going to be watching George C. Scott, a gentleman, really, like the classic definition of just a stoic gentleman? Am I going to see him afraid and acting surprised or running from ghosts and noises in a horror film? I am not going to watch those things. And I am curious how much of the script revolved around, listen, I don't know the type of man George C. Scott was in private. He was married 5 times. I don't know what that says about anybody, that they're bad at marriage. Although he did remain married to Trish Van Devere Um, I'm hoping that they were happy together, but he definitely seems like a man of his generation who would find the idea of him expressing any emotions ludicrous. And so by incorporating the death of his wife and daughter early on in the picture, there are ways in which, narratively speaking, they deal with it where he doesn't need to actually mourn them, and he's allowed to instead intellectualize his previous feelings, which he assures you he had in the moment of their tragic death. Because while they're pushing the car in the snow, and he does indeed go to make a phone call, and they're horrifically, it's not graphic, but it's still horrifically struck by this oncoming vehicle in a snowy swerve accident. We see him in horror kind of drop down, no dialogue, no sound on his part, and then we're out of here. Now we're seeing this man, we can assume that it's been some time later, and he's walking silently by himself on the street. Vacation's over. He's not smiling, but there's nothing else going on with him. And then the next moment, when he's finally speaking, he's sitting down having a cigarette in a suit with his necktie absolutely cutting off the circulation to his head. And he's just saying, I was walking around the house just saying, they're gone, they're gone, they're gone, until I finally realized, they were gone and I had to move on. And that's it. Like, it is very much like stiff upper lip. A man's heart is stony. You are supposed to suck it up and move on, because you got music to compose, my friend. You don't got time to be sad about things. And so we're going to see him laughing and in a party. And so little is hinges on the fact that his family was murdered. I wonder what the conceivable point of that being. Is it, in your estimation, what gives him a connection to what he'll encounter later? Or is it just flavor?
I think so. I think it does just give him a connection, even though he will belie that connection numerous times and be nothing but annoyed by its playing on that connection. It's just the reasoning as to why he moved, I guess. Now, this is based on a real story that happened. And I suppose parts of this mirror that true story to give more of a connection or flavor, as you've said, because yeah, it seems like such a minuscule part of it, except for establishing and giving it this modern American feel, despite it being filmed in Canada, despite it being a very British feeling film. It takes place like very rooted in the US, and they want to go coast to coast with this. So we got to start out in New York and end up on the other side. We got to like show both coasts. We got to show New York and Seattle in all their glory and landmarks and such, and make him feel like a very important, famous, jet-setting person. Like, how would the uber famous and ultra rich handle something like this? And I think that that's them trying to like really cement him into that upper echelon, right? Even though we know that people have feelings despite their station in life. And he very well should have had a few of them. I like that your point that he assures you that he has had feelings. He also says something that sets us up for his level of annoyance when the haunting starts, and he says, I can't go through this again. And not in like a heart-wrenching way, in a matter-of-fact way. That I just went through this, I am mad now that I'm being reminded of dead children at all.
There was a hilarious observation I saw recently on the internet about how toxic type men, deny their feelings by saying that anger and rage aren't emotions somehow, but because those are the only ones that they're comfortable expressing. And I think that that annoyance, that rage, that is the emotion that, listen, I've only seen a few of George C. Scott's films, but that seems to be what he's the most comfortable doing. Do we know much about Russell Hunter, the playwright that this original story was based off of? Was he an angry fellow? Do we have any idea?
No, and I wish I did, because I will say, like, we don't know George C. Scott very well, and I'm not a fan of 12 Angry Men. I don't even know if I watched the film in its entirety, but I often went through people would be like, "Oh yeah, The Changeling, George C. Scott," and I'd be like, "Yeah, whoever the fuck that is," because it didn't dawn on me, like I didn't care, like his name meant nothing to me, his face was not recognizable, and it was only recently looking up, like, oh my gosh, he was in The Death of a Salesman that I first saw. The 1975 play had been filmed, and I watched a VHS of this in school, and his performance struck me because I thought, oh yes, he is such a perfect Willy Loman, except he's a little bit too big and booming. And I don't know if the playwright was big and booming. George C. Scott was apparently a notorious drunk and a rageaholic as well. And not happily cementing himself in that world either. He didn't like being rageaholic, alcoholic, but he was. And he was like very much of that men swallow their emotions and push them deep down inside and be a man's man, stiff upper lip sort of upbringing. Like that was him in a nutshell. He was a man's man, and just notoriously cranky too. And I've learned a lot of his cranky side from Joe Bob Briggs and watching the Joe Bob version of this film as well, or the Joe Bob portions at least. And yeah, so I learned a little bit about what he was really like. I also recognized him as Ebenezer Scrooge, and those are really my only spots of George C. Scott where he's probably more subdued, because there isn't a lot of, like, Willy Loman does lose his mind in Death of a Salesman, but not as much with the ranting and raging as George C. Scott was capable of. Or Ebenezer Scrooge, we know how that story goes. There's not as much room. So there's probably a few scenes that really lend itself to George C. Scott, like standing at the bottom of the staircase, screaming up into the heavens, like enraged with this ghost. That's very much George C. Scott, I think. I don't know if the playwright was an angry, drinking, stomping on the terra, crushing skulls kind of guy, like the George C. Scott of my mythology. Some people would say George C. Scott was a terrible human being just because of that, because he was a big, booming, angry, drinking, womanizing, I guess, until he met Trish, because maybe she could keep him on the straight and narrow. I don't know. Anyone that's married like multiple times has some sort of streak in them, I'm sure. But he was also at the same time very like Burt Reynolds-y man's man.
Yeah. I think people would find his most famous role, he played General Patton in that movie Patton in 1970. Like that iconic image of the American flag with with Patton, like with the helmet, and he's like doing his big speech. I think people would know him a lot from that. Listeners, listen. You're wondering, why the fuck are you spending so much time talking about George C. Scott? The reason should be obvious, but if it's not, I'll let you know. He's in every fucking scene of this movie. And so how he carries himself throughout this entire film absolutely dictates the tone of the film, because I can guarantee you the thrills, chills, and spills, the moments of horror where people are actually frightened by things, do not involve him. It's other people around him who are perhaps better off expressing those types of lower emotions as fear and sadness and grief. Although, to be fair, there's one scene in which, much like Hank Hill in his garage, George C. Scott does cry I'm assuming he had just woken up from a nap and then was therefore particularly vulnerable to his own emotions. But John Russell, our character, if I just kind of put that together, that like, oh wait, Russell Hunter, John Russell, is that's probably has
Yeah.
something to do with it. When we see John Russell and he is all done being sad about his allegedly sad about his family's death, he now has gone to Seattle and he rents a mansion. And he rents it from this historical society. I've never even heard of historical societies doing this type of thing. To me, when you say historical society, I'm assuming a place is a museum of some kind or some kind of local type of thing, like, you know, in a small town where they're like, here's the town's history, like a particularly prominent, like Billings Bridge, you know, like it's like the house has become a monument of sorts. And I didn't think that you rented it out to someone who might want to live there, but John does want to live there, at least temporarily, while he works on his next piece. He's a composer, didn't you know? And this opulent, beautiful, oh my God, so gorgeous of a place has a piano, wouldn't you know?
Yeah, like it was just put there. I think that this historical society renting out places is a little bit more of a Commonwealth British thing. Like I'd like to think that the house that is the Keg Manor here is rented out to the Keg restaurant, and it is also a historical landmark and is owned in part by the city or the NCC or something. Because I know that the garden next to it, Maple Lawn, is. So I'm sure other properties are treated like that. And I know that in the UK, there can be families that own, with scare quotes around it, castles and such, but they really are part of some other commonwealth, right? So they are sort of renting it, I think. So this made a lot of sense to me. There are probably properties all around Ottawa that we are blind to, that are vacant for one, historical landmarks for two, and up for rent for the right person who will caretake it. Maybe part of that is like, oh, you want to rent this multi-room mansion that is owned by the historical society. Do you have a fleet of servants at your beck and call, which this composer John Russell does? So at the beginning he does have hired help. I don't know where they go. They don't mention that he like lets them go, that I've noticed, like his housemaid and the man that actually takes care of this house that is
Mm-hmm.
contracted by the historical society. You don't see hide nor hair of them throughout this whole thing. But I think that it's interesting because it is so opulent, and it speaks to us on, this is a ghost story house. This is a haunted house bar none. It's got, wainscoting and balustrades, and it's got, it's just sort of flying buttresses. It is a gorgeous looking haunted house, but it's a set. It's all a set. It's all a continuous set in a soundstage, which makes me feel a little ripped off because I wish I could see this house. It's done well enough to the point that you really feel grounded in this house. When they are going from the exterior to the interior, you don't feel like it's that big of a change. It's believable. They handled this stage very well, this set, because you feel like you know this house. You feel like you know the geography of the upstairs and downstairs and the adjacent rooms of this house. They did it very, 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 very well.
I agree. And one of the things that I find interesting is the costuming on top of everything. John Russell looks like he belongs in the house. Doesn't he? It's not this example of somebody who is dressed quite modern. He's dressed quite old fashioned and also doesn't allow himself to go below a certain manner of dress. He is the
Mhm.
most casual he ever is in this film. He's still wearing 3 layers. And I mean, if he could be wearing spats, he might have done it. But I think that I think that all the sweaters and the button and like just tie, dress shirt. If he's not wearing a jacket, it's a sweater over top of all of that. Slacks, polished shoes. He is a gentleman's gentleman. And a lot of times he is just brooding in his study. Now, the paranormal activity, Lydia, begins almost immediately. And they do something quite interesting here in which all of this stuff can happen at all times of day. And in fact, mostly does happen during the day or quite early in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning. He begins to hear these incessant banging noises. He probably is thinking, oh my God, all this noise, I can finally cry. But in, but instead, he is infuriated by this banging sound, which sounds quite like pipes banging.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. And having the water turn off and on all by itself would add to that. There is a constant drip sound throughout this film. So if you're annoyed by drip sounds, or if you have a dripping faucet, you may be tricked into thinking that it is a dripping faucet in your own home because it is just dripping almost constantly throughout this film, which is a really good oral trick. The sounds of this film, and I had said that the score is really underwhelming. Some of the piano pieces, specifically the piano piece that he composes that we'll talk about shortly, is really pretty. Like if you like piano music, this is really good that way, in that 80s horror piano piece kind of way. But the taps and the poltergeist sort of activity and the banging and such is also a herald to what is going to be the predominant and most scary, probably if he was capable of being scared, to John Russell, is the visions. And this happens, I believe, 3 times through this film where he is overtaken with a vision of the past or the current situation outside of himself, sort of an astral projection. And they don't really delve into astral bodies or astral projection, but it does happen a couple times throughout this film. And this is one where he gets a flashback to the past, and not the most lengthy flashback, but it's just a glimpse of a boy in a bathtub, a drowning boy in a bathtub. And it's quite unsettling. And I'm sure a lot of people find this scene unsettling. I found it mostly confusing.
Well, I could tell you who's not confused by this whatsoever. It's John Russell. He has instantaneously has this streak in him where he is going to go sleuthing. He wants to know what is going on with this property. At no point during his early stages of the investigation, once he has established that there's no pipe, the pipes, like the explanations, what the noises could be, all this other stuff, he immediately is incredulous about any rational explanation. He is like ghosts.
It's ghosts.
It's ghosts. And doesn't he not come off as such an overly rational person that he would almost be bullheaded in believing that it could possibly be ghosts? It would have to be somebody else. And I think, I want to know your thoughts on this. Do you think that's why so many ghost stories seem to be like the protagonist seems to be a woman if they're not, and because it isn't like, is it some kind of attempt to say that they're more open or this, that, or the other thing, or and it's the pipe smoking man's job to say like, just here, take this cold compress and go lay down, like you're crazy, or what?
Yeah, it's a little subversive in that way, and I really like it because the way that he plays his character here and the way he's written, you really almost want it to be called The Raccoons and have it about a guy who has a raccoon infestation because of the way he's like, we got to call in some professionals. We're going to get the raccoon specialists in here, and I'm going to start tearing shit out of this wall. I'm taking these shelves off because I see a door behind there, and I'm going up there because that's where the raccoons are. And I'm going to get to the bottom of this, and I'm going to eradicate these raccoons or whatever it is he thinks he's going to do with the ghost. Because, yes, if it was a woman, we would be focusing on the motherly angle. We would be focusing on the feelings. We would be focusing on the fact that she's probably crazy, because that is how all those other ghost stories are written, uh, depressing as that is. So
Yes.
we take those two ideas together, that this is somebody who believes in ghosts, even though they look bored out of their fucking tits at the own seance that they organized. But he does believe in this. He's not once saying like it can't be ghosts. Someone, prove it to me that it's ghosts. He believes it's ghosts. But he's
Yeah.
also not going to be like, oh, this is, my fatherly instincts are going to come to
None.
fruition and I'm going to go and save this child. It's no, I'm going to get this annoying raccoon out of my attic. That's how he's
It
approaching it. So it works,
it it
though.
it really is just the facts, ma'am. Just the
Yeah.
facts. I want to know who, what, when, why. How do we stop this nonsense? Because I got to get back to composing music. That scene in which he busts through that closet door, he did that because, well, walking the grounds as a gentleman does with his hands in his pockets, one of the red stained glass windows erupts from the inside out, and
Hmm.
all of that glass goes down onto his towards his feet outside, and he looks at it like, again, a look of just pure annoyance on his face, and then looks up and he's like, well, I've never thought about what could be in this area. I need to find out how you get up to that window. Obviously, it's an attic of some kind. He gets into this room, which is the most cobweb laden room that is humanly possible. There's an old style wheelchair in there that has become something of the main iconography of this film. It's in all the posters, and it's very interesting looking. I don't know if this is just what wheelchairs looked like in 1900 or what.
Somewhat. It depends, and I don't know if there was different styles of wheelchairs, because we had turn of the previous century wheelchair at my grandmother's, and it was far more rickety but wider. It was my
Mm,
great grandmother's wheelchair, and it was yeah, it was sort of like the equivalent of a penny farthing bicycle as far as wheelchairs goes, where this looks really institutional. It's narrow, it's made of a lot of like flat slats of metal instead of like tubing.
it almost looks a bit like a wicker chair that someone attached wheels to. Not wicker. You know what are those chairs with all the little holes in the back? Yeah,
Yeah, like a wicker chair. There's
yeah.
another word, I think, like a cane chair. But
Yes.
it also looks like a child's electric chair.
Yeah. And what we learned through weird um I was watching this film with my partner Cassandra, and they could not get over the fact that there was a wash tub in this room that was carpeted, and I said, well, in this old estate, I bet you they didn't really have running water in going to all of the rooms. Or perhaps even the running water would have been something that was added later to the property. And so beforehand, you just would, that's what you did. You just brought in, that bathtub was mobile until you put water in it, then it would be too heavy to move. But for a little kid, yeah, just bring it out and wash while you're there. He was probably too sickly to go in there. I'm getting ahead of myself though, because I do want to talk about this seance that John Russell, who, by the way, enlists Claire, who is the person who rented him the home. She represents the historical society.
Like a real estate agent that just has like he doesn't call the groundskeeper to come and take a look at this broken window. He goes busting through walls himself, which is
Mm-hmm.
not right. And I will point out that in the UK it's very normal to have carpeted bathrooms, much to Cassandra's chagrin because it is disgusting. But yeah, and I know there's some Italian families homes that I've been in that have carpeted bathrooms, but yeah, he calls up the real estate agent to come hang out all the time because like
It's
there's a maybe a blossoming romance, but he has absolutely no emotions, so we would never know that.
yeah, I can't even imagine him, the character of John Russell, having any. Like, he comes off as
Yeah,
completely asexual, which I don't care. You don't need to have. You don't need to insert. In fact, if they tried to insert a romance into this narrative, I would find it patently absurd.
yeah, yeah,
But
absolutely.
he has become transfixed by this process of trying to figure out what this 100% ghost wants. This is a ghost, ladies and gentlemen. There is no if, ands, or buts. He goes to his. The way that you point that out is so fucking hysterical. He goes to his real estate agent who rented him the house and essentially demands of her to explain what this thing could possibly want. Sir, what? Are we friends? He
Yes.
he
Well, she's a woman and he's a man, so he can just, impress upon her his needs.
I was like, don't you see this is of dire importance? They get themselves a seance going, automatic writing. I love this sequence, by the way. And for
Me
some
too.
reason, when I think about this movie, I always am just thinking of the automatic writing scene. But again, George C. Scott, John Russell acts so put upon in this scene. Bro, you organized this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, imagine if you threw a party, dear listeners, and then 20 minutes into the party, you started to demand everyone explain what they're doing here.
George C. Scott ain't got time for this shit. He wanted this seance to go like this. He wanted them to come in and be like, oh, yeah, it's that little girl that got hit by the coal cart. That's it. You know what you need to do is put out some ghost traps upstairs in the attic. And then, uh, by tomorrow morning, this will all blow over.
He, I do really enjoy the microfiche scene. You know me, anytime that there's microfiche, I get excited. And this really goes kind of, gang, if you've ever heard old Lids and I talk about microfiche, I approach it with wide-eyed wonderment as if it's the most exciting thing in the world. Lydia, who has been to the Hall of Records and knows how to work their way around microfiche and has actually done these sorts of things before, always tries to burst my bubble. Tries, but she
Oh,
never
tries.
succeeds.
I
To
worry very much that your perception of microfiche is tainted by movies like this one, where you find what you're looking for within 4 fucking minutes.
But I was going to say, Lids tries to burst my bubble and explain to me that microfiche and looking through old records is boring. Tut tut, I say. But they kind of indicate a little bit that this might be a long process because, yes, they do find the information they're looking for in 4 minutes. But they they do have to like spin the dial a little bit, and they also need to zoom in on things a little bit. And it's it's quite a thing. But they find out that there was something to this property, Lids.
And it makes it seem a little bit hoity-toity or old-fashioned because a coal cart has run over this little girl who succumbed to her injuries um, quite quickly. So we are assuming that it's a little girl that is haunting this place. But then we find out that it is a little boy in the seance.
Mm-hmm. Joseph. they are going to, I mean, they're not going to bury the lead at all. We're going to hear this little boy. We're going to see this kid get dragged through the tub by his ankles. So we know that the water, the dripping, the banging of the pipes, water is very central to the tragedy that occurred to this little boy who we
which
learn. Go ahead.
which doesn't fit at all with what they've learned about the little girl. Of course, there's no mention of this little girl, but there is mention that there was a young boy who lived in this house named Joseph, who was quite sickly and then was sent off to Paris, I believe, for school,
Mm-hmm.
never to step foot again on American soil, according to the newspapers.
um, John has the detective skills of, or logic leaps of somebody who should be at least a television detective, because we got to get out of here in 22 minutes, so we need to solve these crimes very fast.
He is very
Um
Matlock. And this young boy, John Carmichael, who moved into the house right after the little girl had gotten killed outside, which makes me think there's a whole movie hiding under here about this, whatever burial ground underneath that house that has killed a little girl before that. We could go and do the Changeling uh origins film or something like that about the little girl. It would be fun to do. But he figures, and like you said, logic leaps, that the whole reason that this little boy was whisked away must have something to do with an inheritance.
yes. Well, when you're dealing with old money, you're dealing with a family legacy. I understand. I'll be honest with you. The one of the reasons why I feel as though this seems so outrageous to me, but perhaps the time was, at the time it was not as outrageous. Do you think that it just has something to do with the fact that you and I are just too young and not affluent enough to understand that if you were a man in his 50s, a man of means in his 50s, this would all seem so fucking obvious to you because you deal in a higher society and you're dealing with people who were born in like the 1880s, 1890s, people who died in 1926? Does it all seems to make more sense because that's just how it was back then? Or is this just writing because we want to get past these facts fast?
Partially, yeah. I think that it is convenient that it must have something to do with an inheritance because it's an old rich family with a big old house and old money, and everyone's always bloodthirsty about inheritance. And this we learnt from the beginning of Creepshow with
Yes.
Father's Day. Yeah, it's all about the inheritance. But then yes, it is also a little different in the 80s where inheritance meant something a little more different, and it was all very particular, and things wouldn't automatically be divvied up between people because everyone would be taking everyone to court because there weren't laws in place that automatically put some wheels in motion. It's a little different now where things are a little more cut and dried. You can go get a will kit down at the local Staples, where you couldn't as much in the 80s. It was a little bit more of a thing.
Do you feel that the story with the coal cart is necessary for the overall narrative of this film?
No, and I didn't understand why it was even really put in there because maybe this is a problem of, um, the hindsight being 2020 and knowing a little bit more about modern script writing techniques that we know now, thanks to books like Kill the Cat or uh, On Writing and the Script and Story, those sorts of books, which have taught us how to write stories based on previous stories. And that is just so it's like a dangling little leftover of a story that is annoying in a way, because it's like that, little scratch in the top of your mouth that you can't forget about. It means nothing. It has no real bearing unless they were thinking of doing some sort of sequel, or unless that was part of Russell Hunter's first initial story and they just couldn't shake it. I would have cut it entirely. Why not just have this kid be named Joseph, you know? Or if you're going to have one little kid killed by a coal cart, why not have a bunch of other red herrings? Sprinkle in like 5 or 6 other dead kids.
It's I completely agree with you. And I'm glad that you said that, because I honestly, I even worded the question in a way to try to make myself seem as less stupid as possible when you cracked it wide open and said, well, Wes, the reason why we're doing this is because X, Y, and Z. The fact that I heard you say that it's completely fucking irrelevant, thank you. Like,
You're
thank you,
welcome.
because I don't understand for a film. Listen, if you want something to be realistic and to go down avenues that are a dead end, or and they do this later in the film, or if you want the main character to because again, jump to conclusions, he is pole vaulting to fucking conclusions about this story. It makes sense for him to be wrong, and then the real truth, the real deep dark truth that he didn't even know, comes out of left field in the third act to surprise your audience. I could understand that. But to have this library scene in which it takes them down an avenue that makes no sense, and then we go to a seance in which we learn, okay, what we're actually focusing on. I'm sitting here still thinking about the fucking coal cart and this little girl.
And they
And
should have done it a little better, actually. And my horror writer's answer to that would be, my horror editor, my horror rewrite answer would be, maybe the whole thing was that the house itself is an embodiment of Joseph, who needed a particular conduit, because John might be open, but he's by no means psychic. So he needs an actual conduit. So how do I get this man to get a medium into this house? Well, I send him down a road investigating a little dead girl, because he just had lost a little girl. And that will actually interest him. A little dead boy who is the son of a magnate who is up for an inheritance and that was crippled was maybe not as important to this man, but what's important to this man is a young dead girl who's the same age as his daughter, who was recently deceased. Which I think it was only like a couple weeks, honestly. I don't even think much time passed, really, from the end of the winter when they were pushing their car through the snow to him moving to Seattle. But um, that would be it. But the it's just not there. Those lines leading me down that path that I want to be there aren't there.
what about this? Because the accident of this little girl happened later, after presumably Joseph died. So by a couple of years, because Joseph,
And I think it happened before, because it was 1900. Oh, you're right. 1909, 1906. Oh, sorry. Carry on. So
so
Joseph.
so if Joseph died in 1906, this little girl died in 1909. Is it possible that the implication is that Joseph, because we see a death occur in a traffic accident shortly later, is this some kind of implication that Joseph's ghost, even just 2 years after his death, or 3 years after his death, is able to, or is trying to get some kind of attention going, and it inadvertently caused a death in and around the property? Because does that make sense? Is that what this is? They never go out and say it, but is that what's going on here?
It must be, but I wish that they would, because otherwise, it's not just you questioning this whole coal cart thing. We were spending a lot of time, but Joe Bob Briggs brings it up on his show a couple times about, I just want to know about the little girl in the coal cart. So, yeah, we could sit down with Joe Bob and have a drink and talk about the coal cart girl, because yeah, it is like a dangling problem, a leftover a red herring that doesn't work right. We want a red herring to be proven wrong. We don't want a red herring that maybe is still around.
Here's the problem, Lids, with Joseph Carmichael being dead. Joseph Carmichael is not dead. He is
Yeah.
an elderly senator at this juncture in his old life. You know, he's got one of those red silky looking smoking jackets on. He's a man of means. He has inherited this humongous fortune. And so you can't go around saying some dead boy is a dead boy when he's an adult man who's an alive man.
And he's 80 years old. Now, 80 years old in 1980 meant something a little different than it does now. We have 80 year olds running around like fucking running countries now, and they're some of them are very fit and very capable. But in 1980, an 80-year-old man might as well be a walking skeleton, which this guy is. Is he from Ghost Story, the actor that plays elderly Jonathan? This is the other actor that maybe rivals George C. Scott in the amount of roles on Broadway and off. And he was in Death Takes a Holiday, which I don't really recall as much as I recall, like The Crucible. And I swore that he was in Peter Straub's Ghost Story as well.
He was.
He was too.
He was Dr. Jaffrey in his final film role.
What a wonderful way to end a storied and lengthy career. I recognized him from that, but not from all the other hundreds of other roles that he's had, because he would be way more recognizable to somebody in 1980, I am sure, because he passed away not long after. But a very good actor, and very much C. Montgomery Burns. He reminds me very much of Mr. Burns because he has people getting in the spruce moose, and he is like a walking skeleton. Like Montgomery Burns is probably like 200 years old or something like that, and they make jokes about that throughout it. But this is a sort of elderly senator at 80 years old, ultra rich kind of person that I'm sure Montgomery Burns was styled after. 80 years old sounded a lot older than it actually is in the 80s, just because of the longevity and the way that we aged back then. So this guy is, absolutely at death's door. But here comes George C. Scott or John Russell barreling across the tarmac, screaming at him and holding this pendant and freaking out about shit and like shaking up this old man's life. You'd want to have a little more delicacy in, hey there, old 80-year-old senator man. Something's come to light that we'd like to discuss. Not the raging, screaming, conspiratorial rantings. Not to say there isn't a conspiracy going on, because the Historical Society, we're not done with them yet. The Historical Society is making some phone calls about, like, hey, someone's poking around into the story of young Joseph, and lets the senator know that George C. Scott is hot on his trail. I did jump a little bit ahead by talking about the necklace, but we'll get there. The Historical Society, I will point out, is the offices are in what I thought was the Flatiron Building in New York. And I thought, oh, they must be just milking some of this New York landmarks. Turns out that is a very similar looking Flatiron Building in Vancouver that still stands. So if you ever want to go and see some of the places where this was filmed, you can definitely go to this hotel. I think it's called the Regis Hotel or the Imperial Hotel. It's some hotel in Vancouver you can go and see this Flatiron building where the historical society was, because of course the house was a set.
When John explains to Claire his theory, the one problem is they don't have a body of presumably the real Joseph Carmichael. So John figures that the Carmichaels owned other property. And there was a place where there was a well, and it was on this open property that was owned by the Carmichaels. And then it was divvied up, and then divvied up again. And then eventually it got so small that they began to build properties on it, and there's a house. And so he figures, I'm going to go to that house and I'm just going to start digging into the floor. And trust me, I'm John Russel, a composer. Let me in.
Yeah. And he's got something going for him though, because not only, like, he did have a little bit of hinting, because he sat down with the reel-to-reel tape after the seance and wrote down every weird disembodied voice he could find and all the words that he could parse out of this recording that I guess no one else had listened to because he had commissioned it because he believes in ghosts. We got to keep reminding ourselves he does believe in ghosts. But he goes to this house, and this the mother says, okay, yeah, we've had some paranormal activity here actually, which is the best answer. And that really propels this plot and saves it in a way, because of the skepticism that is sort of roiling under the surface of the believer in John Russell. Could easily win out, and it could just be raccoons any minute. I feel like any minute his belief will break, but it really helps that he encounters this other very stoic, very matter of fact, very unemotional woman, just like Trish. She's, well, I guess her name's not Trish in this.
No.
Just like his other not wife person, Claire, in this film, a very unemotional, straightforward person.
Who seemed more than happy to just do what he asks.
Yeah. Like, she's like, well, I guess you want to tear up my floor, huh? Like, just jump right to it. I like this lady. It helps the plot. It helps the story. She's just believable enough as not a harried housewife. She's quite the opposite of that. She's like, probably thinking this is a liability as much as he is. I don't know in what world that everyone is just annoyed by ghosts, but that's this world.
Sure enough, in their very Ring-esque type scene, we dig and we find a body. Now, the body is not just any body. It also is in possession of a christening medal, which I had never heard of before.
I've heard of people being given St. Christopher's medals or St. Andrew's medals upon christening, but not like a personalized one. Maybe this is something that the super rich do.
I had a christening dress. It was like a gown.
Yeah.
And my sister and my brother wore the same one. There's actually a photo of me that I have on the day of my christening, and I'm wearing the christening dress. It's humongous. I'm like a literal infant, so it's very funny to see that on me. Joseph begins to communicate really readily with John. He's very focused on the fact that they have his medal. He's acknowledging that that's him. He is Joseph. You have my medal. The real Joseph Carmichael died many years ago when he was 6 years old. Now, John has, he is becoming at his wit's end with this, because he is finding himself backed into a corner when all of a sudden police show up. And it's kind of, give us the metal that you have, or things will get ugly.
Which is so mental. And I like, this isn't the first time that this story tries to suck all of the parenting or the softness or the emotion out of it by turning it into a ghost crime story. This is really what it is at the end of it. It's a horror crime story. And there was a book I've read quite a while ago. It's an old Andre Yerka story from Norway, I believe, that's called The Lake of the Dead. And it is a sort of a gothic horror story, much like this. It's a ghost story that is very grounded with very skeptical people that discuss at length the intellectualized angles of the haunting. And at the end of the day, it's more of a crime story because it's talking about the ghost. Like it's just a fact that the ghost will come and haunt and let us know what really happened and help solve its crime. It's like the only witness to the crime and a believable witness too, because we believe in ghosts. That sort of thing. I don't see a lot of, because crime stories are typically crime stories or they're ghost stories. They're not ghost crime. And this is like a kind of hiding the fact that it is a crime story.
The ghost really wants John to crack this fucking case wide open. It's not enough. To your point, typically these stories are about letting someone know what happened. And it seems to be the person that is open to these scenarios believes, and the ghost narrows in on them. And then you go to the library and you learn about their tragic story. You learn about the murder. You learn about children getting separated from mothers. All of these themes that we see again and again in ghost stories. And I think that really has become why a haunting horror, straight up haunting horror, has kind of become a little less popular as opposed to demons and entities and this, that, the other thing. Because really what they're asking, and what Joseph is asking of John's character, is to bear witness to his past, but also act as their surrogate to solve this crime and to basically, I don't know if it's go to the imposter Joseph Carmichael and admit that you're a fraud. Give the inheritance to who? Does Joseph the ghost care about money? Does he want to get his ghostly beak wet? I don't get it. But at the very least, it is another idea of bear witnessing to buried history. And that really is what is essential to any ghost story. It is, you are to bear witness to it. And this crime aspect seems really strange, but it's over quite quickly in a scene because Captain DeWitt is going to fucking die like immediately.
It's a really interesting scene too. And maybe the whole like not so much bear witness or solve my crime or hold people accountable. It's just a purely Christian motivation of you need to reinter me in sacred ground. Maybe I need a proper burial, all the proper burial kind of stuff. Like if everyone was afforded a fucking proper burial through history, our graveyards would overtake our cities. So yeah, there's lots of improper burials, and we're not having like a ghost haunting court case rampage every fucking week. So yeah, I think it is like a Christian motivation with that one. But I like this scene with the, we didn't even talk about the ball bouncing scene. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
That's
we
crazy
didn't.
that we didn't. That's wild. I just thought of that. But we have the shattering glass scene where we have another vision where we get to see DeWitt's face crash through the mirror in John's house right in front of John, and John gets impaled by a piece of glass from it. So it's a very physical manifestation of a hallucination, of something that's happening right that moment, that is influenced by this ghost. A very powerful ghost when you think about it. Like, aside from, let's go back to that ball scene
Mm-hmm.
where the one of the only real keepsakes that John has is this India rubber ball that his daughter liked to play with, and he brings it with him on the move quite specifically, has his maid pack it specifically, knows exactly where it is at all times, and at one point it comes bouncing down the stairs. As any ghost child does, as some sort of invitation, not necessarily to play, but to believe and to pay attention.
He immediately tries to pitch it off of a fucking bridge.
Yeah.
And
It's so very, like, I get that that's a scary moment to many people in film history, and the next scene involving the ball is the clincher. Normally these sorts of scares come in threes. You know, that whole old tactic of, like, you see the ball, and then you see the ball do this, and then you see the ball bounce down the floor wet. It bounces down the stairs wet because he just threw it off the bridge. The ghost is that powerful, and it's so subtle now. I think because we've been up against so many demonic stories and so many very powerful ghosts, and so many ghosts that basically destroy an entire planet, and ghosts that can stretch through time and space, ghosts that can take over people's bodies, ghosts that are larger than life. We get this little tiny ghost of a small boy who has trouble walking, yet he can cause car crashes, coal cart crashes. He can go and retrieve a rubber ball from a bridge God knows how many miles away. It speaks to a far more powerful ghost, and I just don't think that we're as susceptible to that sort of subtle story writing anymore. That was a lot of alliteration with S's, so sorry.
I think it goes back to, again, this is a massive theme in J horror, but somebody weak in life becoming powerful in death. And that fear of wronging people in life that causes their death, the manifestation of that guilt and anxiety about somebody finding out what we've done, sometimes not just paying with going to jail, but even paying with your life. These types of themes can be incredibly powerful and iconic to storytelling in general. But I think that when you look at what this spirit is capable of doing, it does evoke that we don't know the extent of how powerful, and in particular, how angry this entity can get. Because again, we are dealing with someone who died when they were 6 years old. And I don't know if you've ever seen a particularly angry 6-year-old, but it is a torrent of chaos and unbridled emotion. And I think that is about to come to a head with the death of this police officer, and then in our final confrontation. But everyone's getting pissed off. John Russell doesn't know what the fuck this ghost wants, and he expresses the only emotion a man is allowed to: anger. And demanding to the house, to the whatever itself, what do you want from me? What do you want? And it seems that what he might want is for you to finally, no one's going to get a search warrant and take that christening medal from them anymore, at least until another detective gets on the case.
Yeah.
And I do appreciate that car death, because it does, in my opinion, do enough of a job, if you remember it, to connect it to that coal cart thing. But again, I agree with Joe Bob. Now it makes you wonder, what did that little girl, what was the point of killing this little girl? It seems that Joseph isn't killing people maliciously. It seems as though it's people who are actively impeding on cracking this case. Was this little girl like gonna, I don't know, was she gonna do something that Joseph didn't like and so he killed her? Who knows? We'll never know. John is going to flat out confront Senator Carmichael in his office, in his C. Montgomery Burns like office.
It is very Monty Burns, and another testament to the character of John Russell being dressed so impeccably at all times is that he walks into this super mega super duper triple duper mansion, like way bigger than any mansion he's ever been in. It is the biggest mansion. It is the mansion's mansion. You could fit 20 mansions in this mansion, and he does not look out of place.
And we know that he is like, shit has gone down, right? Like, John's lease has been canceled. Claire is not even the real estate agent, so now she's just got to be his friend, I guess.
Who wants that? Yeah.
I'm just your unemployed friend now. John goes to Senator Carmichael and basically puts the tiger on the table. Just says, I know what happened. This is what happened. Your father, Air Bunnies, killed his son because his son was sick. He was going to die young anyways, and there was no one else to inherit the fortune. So we find you, a young, strapping, ideal man, and we just call you Joseph Carmichael, and you inherit everything, and you become a rich and powerful senator with powerful connections. I don't know what, I mean, covering up someone else's murder, that, I mean, would he really, like, he's not going to lose his inheritance. He's old as fucking dirt.
Yeah. And he seems to have no children. He was plucked from an orphanage, so may have not understood the implication if it was even explained to him as a child. And I think that he doesn't really admit to any of, there's nothing to admit to. Maybe he doesn't know. All he knows is that he was taken from the orphanage to replace a grieving man's son. Maybe if he knows any of that, he may have been told the entire detail, or maybe the entire detail upon turning 21 and inheriting everything. Like, who knows how much he knows, because he doesn't really get into it except for feeling slighted and angry. He's angry. Here's that emotion again. It's the only emotion that he seems to have. He does retain the medal, and once John Russell leaves, he brings out his own medallion, hiding it from other people, but proving to us that he is at least aware that there's truth to this story.
I love this scene quite a bit. I think that Senator Carmichael, it's this idea of perhaps a repressed truth, not knowing the truth fully, or perhaps it's knowing full well and it being exposed to you all these decades later. The thing that he seems the most concerned with is the legacy of his father, who is maybe not his biological father, and perhaps did a monstrous thing by killing his biological father. But from the new Joseph Carmichael's perspective, I think it's more than reasonable to look at it as though I was plucked from obscurity and poverty, and certainly to live a mundane life in which I had nothing, to one of the richest people in America. I am now a powerful senator. I am a man of influence and means, and I, like it or not, my life became incredible because of this monstrous thing. And if only this monstrous thing didn't happen, then I would have been truly blessed and lucky and you know, born with a silver spoon in my mouth. But I was given this opportunity, and this person is here to attempt, he thinks, to blackmail him, in which he offers to how much to, like, keep this quiet. He's not admitting to anything, but he wants John to go away. And I suppose seeing that emotion probably frightened John Russell because he's never seen emotion before. But I think in that moment, and it's done without dialogue. I've been busting George C. Scott's chops. He's a wonderful actor, and I
yes.
think without dialogue, that long consideration, and then he gives him the evidence that he has. This is the only copy of the seance. Here's the medallion. And he leaves. Now, Joseph, the ghost, don't like that.
Which you would think, in any other, nice, neat, wrapped up with a bow on top kind of ghost story, he would go back to the house and you would hear Joseph say, "Thank you," in a disembodied little voice, and he'd cry. And then credits, and we'd have him finally being able to mourn his daughter and wife or something in a lesser story. But no, this is a story written in the 80s with influences of a much more tragic gothic past behind it.
And probably a compunction to want to end things big, because a lot of ghost stories from the mid 70s and the 1980s, they do their creepy ghost thing until their third act, and then they seem to all collectively say, we need to get some shit going here. I'm thinking of The Legend of Hell House, I'm thinking of The Entity, I'm thinking of Poltergeist. There's lots of ghost films that end with a very large third act where not much happens throughout the entirety of the film. This house erupts into fucking flames, and to the point in which it begins to collapse in and around them. There also is, even though there's no admission by Joseph Carmichael, the senator, the living old man, he now seems to have astral projected himself into the house and is now heading towards this room. By the way, we skipped over another fairly iconic thing, is the wheelchair itself attacking Claire, who has come to the house now to look for John. Essentially, John manages to come in the nick of time, and they start to leave as the stairwell, the very famous stairwell that we've been enjoying throughout this entire film, that starts to collapse. And Joseph Carmichael is now entering this place, and John and Claire get out of there, and the house collapses. And within that, it's like the Matrix. If you die in the Matrix, you die in real life. If you die while being astral projected into this spooky house, Joseph, the child, has his final revenge, as he apparently needed something to connect him enough to Joseph Carmichael, the living old man, in order to kill him, which maybe is what he wanted the entire time. Clearly, this is what he wanted in his fits of rage of the fact that he was murdered. But maybe there was a limit to how he could do that, how far his power could travel, or some other thing that we're not aware of. But he does get his final revenge on the senator.
Or the Changeling, as he could also be known, because that's basically what he is. He is the Changeling, and that's the Changeling story within this, because he went and exchanged his dead son for a living one. And it was that angle that made me just frustrated with this film as a teen, which I get now. It's a much more modern story. It's this Prince and Pauper story that, is being supplanted into a gothic, and it's lovely in that way. It's very modern in this telling, with a man in the role instead of a woman. And we go back to that again later on in filmmaking history, where we like to have these dead kids in bogs and dead kids under trees and dead kids in wells that usually women find, or mourning people, deeply mourning people. Like we have Daniel Radcliffe's character in the remake of The Woman in Black, a very deeply mourning person for real, who has emotions, unlike John Russell in this film. The real story is just as insane, really, with the finding of a medallion and going to another house and digging stuff up, and just like the leaps, like you say, pole vaulting to conclusions, which is what they did in the real story, if it's all real, as they did in this. So they do really parallel really neatly, and I really enjoy that angle of it. And even though the house, the iconic house with that wonderful stairwell, isn't real and was never real, the great big mansion that Carmichael lives in is a real college. It was a Royal Military College, and now it is a privately held college, so I'm sure you can still visit that giant mansion.
Which I would love to do, provided it's still, it's not like the mansion in the movie, which of course, like, we get the wheelchair now burnt, the music box flips open. We get a melody that's not really iconic or easy to remember. So that's kind of a shame, but I think ultimately it ends on a pretty interesting note. But what do we got next for him?
Coming up next, we have The Influence, La Influencia, a Spanish film from, I believe, 2017. It's on Netflix exclusively, so not an easy find outside of stinking Netflix, but it is based on a Ramsey Campbell story. And not a lot of Ramsey Campbell books get made into films, so when I was getting into Ramsey Campbell late in the game, because he's a wonderful gentleman, one of our greatest living masters as far as horror authors go, but I hadn't read a lot of his books, a couple, and I've like listened to him talk online and stuff like that. He's just a very approachable, cool guy. But The Influence is one of the scariest books, and it deals a lot with finding out things in your past and a compromised, if not haunted, house. So a wonderful movie. So I hope you enjoy it. This is a straight up Lydia pick.
Well, I'm glad, because it's been a while since we've done a straight up Lydia pick, and I think our listeners will enjoy doing something a little bit more modern as well again. And we are going to be releasing this as our first release in the month of December, and as we know, that is a time for ghost stories, so it is absolutely appropriate.
Absolutely.
I'm Wes Knipe.
And I'm Typical Lydia.
And you've been listening to the alleged emotions of dead air. If you like this show, you can find more episodes and other content on splatterpictures.net, Spotify, or wherever you download podcasts. We also upload all episodes to YouTube now, if you'd prefer to listen that way. You can find us across social media like Instagram, X, and TikTok, and the show is edited by Lydia Peaver and hosted by Lydia Peaver and me, Wes Knight. We'll see you next time.